Okay, hello everybody. My name is Michael, and I will talk a bit about some kind of applied use of these models. So what will I talk about is how we use the language model in building an artificial child and why we wanted to do that. I will explain it soon. So this is actually a huge kind of undertaking funded by FreePro, and it's a lot of different people that have to work together to make this system. So we have a lot of computer scientists, and then we also have social scientists and psychologists. So what we actually want to build is an artificial child that can be used to train people to increase their interview skills for children. Because there are a lot of things going wrong. For example, I'm sure some of you heard about this drap i Akkebakken, where children were interviewed in a wrong way and where the case is now basically opened again. So what we want to do, we want to develop a real-time, realistic, dynamic AI child avatar, which is a huge task. So when we started with that, I think now it's 2 years ago, it was like, okay, maybe we make something that you can talk a bit to, but we are far away from the final product. And then the language models in between, they advanced a lot. And also there was a lot of advancement in the visual part. So now we actually have a prototype that can be used in practice, which is quite cool. So we have actually combined a lot of different AI components, which is often quite a challenge because they in themselves work quite well, but once you start combining them, you get a lot of different issues into the mix. For example, how much time does it take to get information from here to here, which sounds like a simple problem, but can be really difficult. But also, often they are not built to actually talk to each other and so on. Then we also, of course, had this challenge of we have to understand in some way language. And then we also wanted, of course, to make synthetic audio and visual parts, because we didn't want to use real children presented in this system. And on the top of that, we also needed, of course, real interviews to be trained, because you want to make it as realistic as possible if you want to train professionals. So what you usually would do is you have some person talking to a child where something tragic happened, could either be abuse, sexual or physical, but could also be, like in this case, drap i Akkebakken, and you want to do this interview in a way that you don't influence the child. So usually that's simply boiled down to you want to ask open questions, you don't want to ask questions that direct the children into something like, okay, the man with the black hat gave you this candy. That would be kind of leading, that you don't want. So it should be more open. Sounds kind of easy to do, but the research shows that after people got trained in doing these interviews, after a while the quality decreases, or not the quality, but kind of the way they do it decreases, again back to more directed and closed questions. And if you do follow-up training and refreshing, that can actually improve again the skills. So what we need for this is basically we need the visual part, because we need some visual feedback, and then we also need the conversation part. For the conversation, we needed to do speech-to-text, because, of course, you can also type, but it's more natural if you can actually talk to the system. So for that, we used IBM Watson, and then we need a language model that can do things like conversations, but also maybe in the future include emotions, which is ethically quite a challenging problem, I would say. For example, do you really want to build a system that could influence the emotion of the person talking to the system? I think as engineers, we have kind of some things to think about there. And then we want to have a persona, so you want to have, for example, a bot that is a 70-year-old girl, but you also want to have a bot that is a 9-year-old boy, or you want maybe to have even younger than that. And then, of course, you have the conversation. So for that, we started actually using GPT-3 before we used BERT and something called RASA to build a more kind of restricted version. But after we started using GPT-3, this task got much easier for us. As you know, it's kind of trained on general web documents, and then we use what Pierre mentioned before, transfer learning from mock interviews, and also in the future real interview transcripts to kind of fine-tune the model to be more like a child. Of course, this comes also with a lot of challenges, because sometimes it works really well. It has like a childlike conversation, and sometimes it knows about rocket science, which a child wouldn't know if you don't have like a super child. So that's a bit of a challenge. And then, of course, from the language model, we have to go back to text-to-speech. So that's where also the synthetic audio comes into place. which is basically the conversation part. So then on top of that, we have the visualization, where we have images or videos from children that are not real. So we're using generative adversarial networks to create synthetic people. And then we use that to do other things, like we want to generate emotions in the face, we want to do face generation, movement, and then in the future, of course, also body and so on. So you can see it's quite a complex system where a lot of parts have to work together. And on top of that, so that the whole thing actually makes sense, you also want to provide some feedback to the people using the system, because if they just use it to train, they might not know, okay, how many open, how many closed questions do I ask during my conversation. So you also want to have some feedback here. Okay, so these intelligent conversations, as I told you before, we used ChatGPT. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to have these childlike conversations. And actually the fact that ChatGPT is not perfect, that sometimes it starts dreaming up things and so on, that's actually positive for us, because children, when they have these interviews, they sometimes come up with completely weird things that they wouldn't expect, like, okay, a dragon came to me and did this, and so on. So that's actually a positive. We had some challenges in kind of keeping the conversation in the memory, but also how complex the replies were from the child. But also, again, by testing with real child protection service workers, we actually found out, okay, children don't answer that complex. So you're actually quite fine with some smaller replies. And also, again, if they sometimes started talking about completely different things, that was actually seen as normal. So the child protection service people, they were like, okay, this is quite a realistic conversation with the child. I didn't really notice that it got somewhere wrong. So what we built so far, we have some characters that we can use in the system. So here are some names and the different ages, and also what type of abuse they were going through. Here you can see actually image of the chat prototype. So we have different prototypes. We have where you can just type it like in a chat, which you could, for example, use on your phone while you're driving on the bus to train. But we also have a VR version where you can talk in a VR environment, and then we have a 2D version where you just have a 2D screen. Yeah, as I told you before, the feedback is quite important. And on top of the whole system, we had to build another system that kind of follows the conversation, tries to understand what type of questions were asked based on some input from the psychologists and the social scientists, and then analyze this and give feedback. So to make it easy at the beginning, and also for a user study we wanted to do, we keep it to open-ended and closed questions. So basically what the system can do is the person asks a question, the system finds out, is this a closed question or open question, just collects that over the conversation, gives us a feedback. You ask so-and-so many open, so-and-so many closed. And then, of course, it gives some examples. For example, you ask this closed question is bad because of blah, 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 blah. Yeah. So we also tested this with child protection service workers and students, and what you can actually see is that the feedback was quite good. So most of them, they felt that they had to enhance in their knowledge and in their skills, and also that they felt more kind of efficient. What was also interesting is, what we could observe is, there's no emotion whatsoever in the system. So there's no emotion in the facial expression of the avatar or in the conversation on purpose, but people started seeing things. So they were like, oh, now she told me that, and she got sad. So they started seeing sad emotions in the avatar, which was totally not there, which I think is a quite interesting effect that we can explore further. Okay, now I'm going further to the visual avatar. So here you can see actually the VR prototype, which is kind of a simple 3D model. Also interesting for the visual part is that what we found out by talking to psychologists, but also testing with real people, is that you kind of need stepwise increased realism. So if you have new students that should work with children, but are not used to work with them, you don't want the full realistic looking avatar, because that will be too overwhelming. So they will be stressed and so on. So you want to start simple with more cartoonish, and then you can kind of increase the level of difficulty by making them more realistic. So what we're trying to do is, as I told you before, we have some synthetic generated child. So this child here doesn't exist, it's generated image. And then we combine this with audio into a generative network, and then we get the, I don't know, can you play this video? I think you have to click on it.
Hi, I am John, and I am here to tell you about my teacher. I don't like him, and he makes me play a rude game.
So, of course, you can see it's not perfect, but if you combine it with a realistic conversation, people actually found it quite realistic. So, basically, we have two different versions. We have this more kind of realistic children, and then we have this 3D models. And what we could actually see here is what did people like best. And what we found out is that actually the pure audio version was not very popular, and also the VR was the most popular. So people really liked the VR environment, but didn't like just to talk to the avatar without any visual feedback. So the visual feedback is quite important. So how to make this whole thing real time, because a conversation should be in real time. So if you ask something, their answer should come quite fast. So that's really challenging, and we're still working on that. We have some delay now, which is maybe 2 or 3 seconds, which we think is bad from a computer science perspective. But actually, the child protection service people, they didn't notice, because they were like, oh yeah, that's realistic, because if you ask a child something, sometimes they delay quite a lot before you get an answer. So actually, in the user studies, it wasn't identified as a problem. It was more like, this is realistic. Here you could see the avatar in the VR environment. I will not play the whole video because I'm out of time already, I think. So is everything solved? No, of course not. We have a working prototype, so basically people can start using the system. But now the real work just starts, because there's a lot of things we don't understand how it influences actually the behavior of the people. And that's the beauty with research together with social scientists. You can actually really dig into that. How do emotion influence the people? How do the visuals actually influence the people, and so on? So there's a lot of things to do. And of course, also from the technical perspective, we want to have more control over the avatar. We want maybe also that it reacts to different styles of questioning. So, for example, if someone asks too many closed questions, we might want the avatar to be more restrictive in the answers and so on. But thanks a lot.